Instead, I'm going to give you a little bit more of a background from the broad religious perspective. As you know, Jordan was part of the Byzantine Empire. As I mentioned previously, when Constantine the Great decided to become a Christian, he also, in order to have more control over the unified Roman Empire, and he was the first single Roman emperor in many, many years, he got rid of his competition. That's why he was called Constantine the Great. He immediately moved the capital to what today is known as Istanbul, but he named it Constantinople, okay? So Christianity, beginning with Constantine, became very strong in the eastern part of the empire. It was controlled by the Greek Byzantine Church. Today, the Greek Orthodox are very prominent. Now, there's a little competition between the Greeks and the Latins, and you'll see Latin churches here as well. Sometimes they got along, sometimes there's a little bit of a rivalry. By the 7th century, the Byzantines were pretty much in control of this area. We're coming to Petra in a bit. You're going to see some Byzantine churches inside if you do the full tour down the corridor. They found a number of churches. But in the 7th century, a major event took place. You have the rise of the Prophet Muhammad, and this whole area came under Islamic control, including Petra. Now, you may wonder what was the nature of that transfer from Byzantine Christianity to Islam. A lot of the local people actually didn't mind becoming Muslims. Why? Because at that time, this is after Constantine, of course, the Byzantine Christians were fighting the Persians from Iran, today's Iran. And because of these very expensive wars, the emperor in Constantinople was charging very high taxes to the people living in this area. Very high taxes. And so the local Christians, many of whom were Arabs, and some of them were retired Roman soldiers that were resettled here, they got a little tired of paying these high taxes. And so when the Muslims came, many of the Muslims, not all, sometimes there was fighting and there was killing, both sides did some bad things, but generally the Muslim leaders said, look, if you will become Muslim and work under our system, we won't tax you anymore, or we'll greatly lower your taxes. And not surprisingly, that was a great incentive for a lot of people to switch religions. As far as they were concerned, the Christian emperor wasn't such a great guy anymore, and he was taxing them to death. And so a whole bunch of the people here became Muslims willingly. And so from the 7th century on, this was pretty much a Muslim area. Now, why is that important? Well, Christians in the West suddenly found themselves locked off from the Holy Land. You know, the famous stories of Jesus, the famous stories of the Old Testament, Moses, Abraham, which they cherish. Of course, the Muslims cherish them too, but the stories of Jesus, all these places were suddenly not accessible to them anymore, okay? During the Crusades, of course, they tried to come back in and take the Holy Land so they could have access to these places, and they were around here. There's 2 Crusader forts in Petra. They don't usually show them to the tourists. There's one just outside the gate here. There's another inside, not far from the restaurant where you will eat. But they're not so spectacular, so people don't tend to look at those. But the Crusaders were here for 200 years. Then they were kicked out again. So again, Christians didn't have access to this place. You get down to the 16th century. These are bits of history most people don't know. The Christians had one final stronghold, particularly the Roman Christians. That was the island of Cyprus. That's where the kingdom of Jerusalem that they'd had during the Crusades was relocated. I had the privilege of digging on Cyprus one summer, so I went to visit all those sites. So anyway, of course the Muslims didn't like having this dagger of Latin Roman Christianity right in the middle of their territory in the island of Cyprus. So it was a big battle in the year of 1571. I should mention before that there was a more important battle in 1453, and that's when the Muslims finally kicked the Christians out of Constantinople, and the city was renamed Istanbul. So the Muslims now had control of the whole eastern Mediterranean except for Cyprus. Okay, then there was a big battle called the Battle of Cyprus in 1571, and they were able to kick the Christians out of Cyprus as well. So from 1571 onward, the Muslims controlled the complete eastern half of the Mediterranean world. Okay, now, the Muslims were very kind to the Greek Christians, even though they had conquered them. They still allowed them to have churches, but there wasn't huge Christian populations, just small ones under the Muslim domination. The Latin Christians started forgetting what Jerusalem looked like. They weren't able to come, and so that leads me to the Petra story. More and more through the century, from 1571 on, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, and all these places became kind of a mythological place for Christians. They couldn't go there. You know, some could. They would, sneak around and so forth, but it was very hard. Then in 1798, from 1571 to 1798, apart from a very few Christians getting in over here, something happened. It was a guy named Napoleon Bonaparte, and he invaded the Ottoman-controlled, Muslim-occupied area of Egypt. And he was able to conquer Egypt, and that's what we call the beginning of biblical archaeology. Because from that time on, the West became more and more influential against the weakened Ottoman Empire. And more people from the West started coming in to rediscover the Holy Land. Okay, so 1798 was the beginning of a tremendous amount of Western Christian exploration of the Holy Land. Now, in 1812, same year Napoleon was running around Europe after conquering Egypt, there was a guy by the name of Johannes Burckhardt. He was a Swiss explorer, and he wanted to visit the Holy Land. Now, it was still a little dicey, even though the Europeans were having more and more influence in the Ottoman Empire. And so these early explorers, and he was one of the very first ones, through the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, more and more people were coming looking for the Holy Land. And they were making discoveries. They were rediscovering cities. They were rediscovering artifacts. They would go back and tell the Europeans, and this was like people coming from Mars. Well, I was in Jerusalem. Wow, I was in Bethlehem. Well, I saw these holy places, and people loved this stuff. It was very, very important to Christianity at that time. So Burckhardt was one of the first guys to get over here. He actually learned Arabic. He went up to the north, I think it was Syria. He learned how to speak Arabic. He learned how to dress like an Arab, like a Muslim. And he wanted to rediscover Petra because it was so famous in the ancient sources, this incredible city built out of rock. So he disguised himself like an Arab. He spoke Arabic, not very well. He said, I'm really from India and I'm coming here. And he wanted to give a sacrifice at Jebel Harun. And I think on the bus you saw off to the left a little mountain in the distance with a little white building on top. How many of you saw that? Okay, that's the temple, or I should say the shrine, not the temple, but the shrine for Aaron, the brother of Moses. It's thought Moses came through here. And we actually know they came by here because they went up north towards my side of Jalul, and they crossed over, beat Sihon of Heshbon, and went down into the Jordan Valley, across the Jordan River, and conquered Jericho. So Moses came by this area, and hence this valley is called Wadi Moses, or Wadi Musa in Arabic, and the spring is called Ain Musa, the spring of Moses. So there's a strong tradition of Moses being here and of Aaron being buried in this area. So Burckhardt told the local Muslims, the Arabs here, I want to sacrifice to Aaron. And they said, okay, fine. He spoke funny Arabic, but he said he came from a long ways away. He said he was a Muslim. Okay, so they let him go in. And so he quickly took all sorts of records and notes of this place, opening it up for the first time in centuries to the Western world of Europe, and they were thrilled. He never got back. He sent his correspondence ahead by mail. He died in Cairo. In fact, a lot of those early explorers never made it back from their adventures due to, disease or all sorts of problems. And so they were really, courageous people, but they gave the first hint. Eventually, through, of course, the decades, it was easier and easier for Western people to come. And now, with modern archaeology, they're able to go in, clean these sites up, excavate, restore them, and recreate for you the glories of the time of the Nabateans, the Greeks, and the Romans. The final thing that I'll say is that you're going to see an interesting mixture of material culture here, because the Nabateans were great traders. They had contacts during their time from 200 years before Christ, you could actually almost go to 400 years before Christ, to about 200 to 400 years AD. And they had all these incredible contacts, and so you're going to see Egyptian influence in here, Greek influence in the buildings, Roman influence, their own indigenous influence, even Assyrian influence. And so this is a real metropolitan flavor of wonderful ancient architecture all mixed into one civilization of the Nabateans, one of the great trading peoples of the world. It's from this point that people could get frankincense and myrrh, which was traded from Saudi Arabia and other places south. It came through here and would make its way up to Bethlehem and Jerusalem, and actually to the entire Western Christian Empire. There was an incredible trade business going on at that time. So that's a little bit of the background to how Christians and Westerners were interested in this place. Burckhardt, who discovered it, and ever since then this has been a growing popular pilgrim destination. Okay? So that's, any questions or, yeah. Yes, this Petra was the capital of the Nabatean trading empire. One final thing I forgot to say is before that, in Old Testament times, this was an Edomite stronghold. We're in the middle of Edomite land. And there's one mountain in the middle of Petra. It's not far from what they call the palace of the Pharaoh's daughter. Okay, you're going to see it down just at the end of the Roman corridor past the Roman theater. But there's a big mountain, a flat top mountain. It's called Umel Beara, means the mother of cisterns. And on top of that, many decades ago, a British archaeologist named Crystal Bennett did an excavation up there. It was a very difficult excavation. They had to take her up by helicopter. She got to be kind of a big lady. It's hard to climb up there. And so they had to live up there. She didn't like it very much. Some people told me she was doing a little bit too much of this because she was depressed living in the desert. But nevertheless, she had a wonderful excavation, and there is an Edomite city on top. And some people have associated this with the Old Testament story of Selah, when the Edomites, Israelites had a battle, and the Edomites were supposedly thrown off the cliffs. Okay, you remember that story. Some people say it happened here. I don't think so. I do think the Edomites were there, but there's another place at a site north of Petra called Tafila. Just south of Tafila is another place called Selah, even in Arabic today, and there's an Edomite city there as well, archaeologically, and it has cliffs, and I think that's probably where the real battle took place. But nevertheless, the Edomites lived in Petra in Old Testament times. So you're kind of in the heart of the red land of the descendants of Esau here. Okay? Any other questions? Yes, sir.
So the Nabateans all of a sudden disappeared. Why? Disease conquered by some...
There was a big earthquake that happened. Actually, there were a couple of earthquakes, and we don't know for sure, but there was a major earthquake in the 4th century, another one in the 8th century. Yes, exactly. It also affected Madaba, by the way, and probably led to the abandonment of the Byzantine Christian town of Madaba that we saw yesterday. We saw the beautiful mosaics. This earthquake was very devastating, and that probably led to the eventual abandonment of the city. But as I can't remember which of our good guides said, the city was never completely abandoned. Bedu lived in here, and they continued to occupy and control the area for centuries after. So when Burckhardt came, people were here. They were living here, but the great urban civilization diminished after the 8th century for sure. It was probably going downhill a few centuries before that. So people basically, with the earthquakes, everything getting knocked down, people don't like to live when they think their city's going to fall on top of them anytime. And by the way, when you go in, you'll see all the cliff carvings, you know, all these beautiful so-called tombs. Some of them are tombs, some of them are, you know, maybe other things. But in the middle of the city, there's only one freestanding building. That's the temple, or the building of Pharaoh's daughter, so-called, because
number 13.
Yeah, number 13. It has an Egyptian flavor to it, a very distinct Egyptian flavor. If you look around, though, there's Byzantine churches being excavated, and you'll see lots of piles of stones. There are actually a lot of freestanding buildings in Antiquity. They have all fallen down. If you lift them up, there's the foundations of all kinds of wonderful buildings from this ancient city of Nabatea. Even today, some people, they're not supposed to, but they sneak in and they dig down and they find wonderful treasures in the ruins of Petra. That's totally illegal, but what I've caught people doing it. I walked in in the old days, you could go in at night. You didn't have all this tourist stuff, and I remember walking in by myself at night because I wanted to experience Petra all by myself. And I saw on a distant hill in the middle of Petra where nobody was, a lamp. And I walked over to see what was going on, and I saw some guys digging up stuff. And they saw me, and they said, "You're not going to tell, are you?" So they've been making money this way for centuries. I said, "No, I don't have anyone I can tell anyway." So they were happy and continued on with their illegal excavation. But most of the stuff, by the way, they're going to sell you trinkets. Most of it is facsimiles. You know, it's illegal technically to do authentic selling. but there are some beautiful things. You know, by the way, when you see stuff, my rule of thumb is if you like it, buy it, because you're probably not going to see it anywhere else. So you have to decide. In terms of the negotiation, our guys are giving you good advice, but you have to decide, what's this worth to me? I'm all the way from the United States over here. Is this something I want to show my friends? If it is, then it's probably worth what you're willing to pay. Okay?